Oh my God.
On October 14, 2016, Bigfoot stole my animals from my farm, but before he got away, I shot him with my gun, which turned out to be a horrible decision. What the Sasquatch did to me and my animals next is the deadliest thing that has ever been shared about Bigfoot on the internet. My name is Marcus Webb, and I run a 240-acre cattle ranch in the Cascade Foothills outside Packwood, Washington, about 15 miles from the nearest town. I've been on this land for over 2 decades, and I had never seen Bigfoot until the night of October 14th. But this was no ordinary night. The ranch had been quiet all through October. The herd was healthy, with no predator pressure since late summer when a bear had tested the eastern fence line twice and moved on. That was the last time anything from the forest came onto the property with real intent. On the night of October 15th, around 9:45 p.m., I heard the cattle start making noise. Somehow, this was not the low, restless sound they make when a coyote is working the perimeter. It was sustained, panicked bellowing, the kind that comes from active pursuit or active contact, as if something were chasing them. So I grabbed my flashlight and gun and headed toward the pasture to check. The sound got worse as I got closer. The bellowing was layered with multiple animals, and beneath it I could hear something else. Heavy footfalls in the pasture soil, much heavier than anything deer or elk make. I reached the fence line and put the flashlight across the field. Up ahead, I saw a huge animal. It was Bigfoot. Bigfoot was 150 yards out, deep in the pasture, with a calf's hind legs in both hands, pulling it across the ground toward the eastern tree line. The flashlight beam caught it full on, and for a second, I just stood at that fence and processed what I was looking at. The calf was alive, legs kicking, full panic, trying to find its footing. Bigfoot was moving it steadily and continuously, as if the 400-pound weight were not a variable at all. He didn't move fast or slow. Seeing I needed to save my calf, I shouted. Instantly, Bigfoot stopped, and his head turned toward the flashlight beam. And then he held there, looking at me, still holding the calf's legs, while I stood at the fence with a rifle I hadn't raised yet. Those eyes caught his flashlight. I saw a greenish eyeshine, steady and direct, the way eyeshine looks when an animal is fully focused on what it's looking at, rather than tracking movement. After a few seconds, Bigfoot turned back to the tree line and kept dragging the calf. This time, though, I raised my gun. At first, I fired a warning shot into the air, and just so you know, a .308 is not a quiet rifle. The shot cracked across the pasture and echoed off both tree lines, and everything in the field went still for a beat, including Bigfoot. This caused Bigfoot to release the calf, but now he was standing to full height. I want to put a number to what full height looked like from 150 yards with a flashlight. Still, the honest answer is that the numbers I came up with in that moment, 8 feet, 8.5, feel inadequate now that I've had years to think about what I was actually seeing relative to the fence posts behind it. The top of my fence posts sits at 5 feet. Bigfoot's shoulders were well above them by a margin. Whatever the measurement was, it did not belong in a Pacific Northwest cattle pasture. Then Bigfoot screamed, a deep roar that started low and built and then sustained for about 4 seconds. I felt it even from 150 yards, not the sound itself, but the pressure behind it, the low frequency that bypasses your ears and registers somewhere in the body instead. The cattle that were still upright pressed against the far fence. A group of them that had been milling along the south side went still and stayed still. Then Bigfoot reached back down, picked up the calf's legs, and walked the remaining distance to the tree line, where it disappeared into the forest. Apparently, my warning shot had accomplished nothing except confirming that I was there. I stood at the fence for a moment after Bigfoot went into the trees. The cattle were still bunched against the far fence. The pasture was quiet, and there was a drag mark in the soil from where the calf had been pulled. I stood at the fence and looked at it. This was a problem. I called my neighbor, Tom Harrison, and told him that someone was stealing my cattle and that I needed another set of eyes and another rifle. Tom had worked on ranches his whole life, and he didn't ask many questions. He showed up at 10:15 p.m. with his 2 adult sons, all 3 armed, and we moved toward the tree line with flashlights. We found the calf about 200 yards into the forest. It was dead, its neck broken cleanly. The kill was efficient, the kind of efficiency that comes from something that knows exactly where to apply pressure and in what direction. It turns out that Bigfoot had carried the 400-pound animal 200 yards into a dark forest, killed it, and left it there. I don't know exactly what that means, but I know it's not the behavior of an animal hunting for food in any straightforward sense. Just then, we heard the coops. When we arrived, the chicken coop was not the way I had left it that evening. The door had been pulled completely off and thrown several feet to the left of the entrance. There was a shadow inside. It was Bigfoot. What it was doing there was systematic, not a frenzy, not the scattered chaos a predator in a confined space usually produces. Bigfoot was moving through the coop, picking up laying hens with both hands, breaking their necks with a single quick twist, and dropping the bodies. He moved from one hen to the other, and there were 60 hens in that coop. It had been in there for less than 5 minutes by our estimate, and had already worked through a significant portion of them. At least 10 were dead, some without their heads. I raised my gun and fired at center mass from approximately 80 yards. The shot hit, and I know it did because of what happened next, and because of the blood we found there afterward. I was aiming for Bigfoot's upper chest, which was the largest available target. The impact registered on his body. A visible flinch, a half step back. But what followed was the response of an angry beast. Bigfoot turned to us. He roared, not the sustained territorial sound from the pasture. This was shorter, sharper, and was directed outward. Bigfoot was coming for us. I had to take down some things about this night just so this video doesn't get taken down by YouTube, but there are some hidden details about my encounter with Bigfoot that are very, very disturbing. But don't worry, I attached all of it in a file down below. Check the description at your own risk. Anyway, as soon as I saw Bigfoot racing towards us, I ran. Even though there were 80 yards between me and the barn, Bigfoot covered. Half of it in the time it took me to cover mine. Luckily, Tom and his son split off toward their truck. I made it to the barn door and shut it behind me with the rifle up and my back against the wood. Bigfoot smashed the door just seconds after I closed it. But something worse happened. Bigfoot grabbed the door frame from the outside and pulled, took hold of the structural frame the door was set into, and applied force outward, away from the barn wall. I heard the support beams inside the wall give way, one after another, with a sequence of sharp cracks as the connection between the door frame and the barn's front wall failed. The frame came away from the wall, and part of the front section folded inward. A large gap suddenly opened to the night where the solid wall had been 2 seconds earlier. Bigfoot didn't enter through the gap, though. Instead, he moved along the exterior, grabbing boards and pulling them outward. Each pull took a section of the front wall siding with it. Some boards splintered, some came away in longer pieces, and some took framing nails with them as they went. It was pulling the barn apart from the outside, moving laterally across the front face, board by board. Bigfoot was destroying everything. I went out the back door and ran for the house. Behind me, the demolition continued. 2 roof sections came down while I was running. I could hear the crash of interior beams hitting the floor, the sound of corrugated roof panels coming off their supports. By the time I reached the house and looked back through the window, the front third of the barn structure was open, and Bigfoot was still working along the remaining wall section, still pulling. At 11:03 p.m., Bigfoot left the barn and moved back to the cattle pasture. There were 3 young steers in the near section of the pasture, each between 600 and 800 pounds. I watched from the house window. Bigfoot was on a crazy rampage. The first steer didn't make it 10 yards before. Bigfoot caught it by the neck and put it down with the same efficiency it had used on the calf. The movement took maybe 2 seconds from contact to the animal being on the ground. I have watched livestock die from predator attacks, even from bears and tigers, but none of them looked like that. The speed was one thing, the precision was another, and there was a lot of blood. The second steer had a better angle and got more distance across the field before Bigfoot closed the gap. Even with how fast it was, this wasn't a chase that lasted more than a few seconds. Soon, Bigfoot had the animal's hind legs, pulled it down, and stomped on the skull. The steer did not move after that. The third steer made it the farthest. I watched it reach the far side of the pasture, the full 300 yards of open ground, before Bigfoot caught it. But what happened next really caught me off guard. Bigfoot grabbed the animal around the torso, a 730-pound steer, and lifted it completely off the ground. He carried it approximately 30 feet of open pasture while the animal was still struggling, hooves off the ground. Then Bigfoot threw it into the fence line. The fence posts on that section were treated 6x6 timber. 6 of them snapped. The last steer died on impact. Even with the rifle in my hand, I couldn't do anything. I just provoked Bigfoot, and I had to bear the consequences. Just then, Bigfoot moved to the equipment shed. My shed housed 2 tractors, my ATV, and a full set of farm implements, along with tool storage. The rolling door on the front is an industrial gauge mounted on a heavy-duty overhead track. Even with the weight, I had just one question in mind. Could Bigfoot break in? Bigfoot grabbed the bottom of the door and hanked it upward off its track in one motion. The track produced a sound that carried clearly across the property, even from the house. Then, Bigfoot went inside. What I heard over the next several minutes: the crash of the ATV overturning on the concrete floor, the progressive sound of metal shelving units pulling down and hitting the floor in sequence, one after another, spaced by about 4 seconds each as it worked its way along the wall. Individual tools scattering, the high metallic ring of wrenches and sockets hitting concrete, and 2 separate heavy impacts I couldn't immediately identify. I identified them the next morning. Both were from the tractor's front loader assembly, struck hard enough to crack the metal housing in 2 places. A front loader assembly on that model weighs approximately 800 pounds and is not a component that cracks from incidental contact. The shed went quiet for about 30 seconds. Then Bigfoot came back out. It was carrying one of my 55-gallon diesel drums. Full, that drum weighs close to 400 pounds. It was carrying it overhead in both hands, moving with it across the open ground toward the smaller barn. And the way it moved with that weight was the same deliberate, unhurried pace it had used all night, not straining and not adjusting its gait to compensate for the load. Moving with 400 pounds overhead, the way you'd carry something you weren't bothering to think about. It threw the drum 20 feet of open ground between where it was standing and the barn's near wall, and the drum went through the siding and into the interior space beyond it. The diesel soaked into the barn floor and ran down through the boards. By some specific luck I still think about, nothing ignited. If it had, that night would have ended differently in ways I don't want to calculate. At 11:26 p.m., Bigfoot went back to the chicken coops. There are 3 coops on my property. The largest was the one it had already hit. The second and third were smaller wooden structures on the south side of the barn complex, 20 hens each. Solid construction, but not designed to stop what was out there. It went through all 3. The methodology on the second and third was faster than the first. No digger ripping this time, just the wall. Bigfoot put both hands on the near wall of each structure and pushed inward, collapsing the frame in a single motion, then worked through the interior. Some birds got out into the dark, most didn't. In less than 10 minutes, it killed everything it could catch across all 3 coops. The count the next morning was 51 chickens dead. Some of those I had raised from chicks. Tom and his sons had repositioned the truck toward the driveway by then, headlights on, filming on their phones. Bigfoot saw the headlights. It charged the truck from about 100 yards. Tom told me later that the speedometer was at 35 miles per hour before they hit the paved road. Bigfoot ran approximately 50 yards in pursuit before stopping, and by Tom's account from the rearview mirror, it was not the truck getting far enough away. What stopped it was a decision. It pulled up at a specific point, planted, and stood there while the truck continued accelerating away. It stood in my driveway and roared for nearly 6 seconds. I heard it from inside the house with the windows shut. The sound was different from the ones earlier in the night, longer, louder, with a quality I can only call declarative. Not a threat aimed at something specific, not the sharp, directed roar it had produced when I shot it. Something broader than that. The sound moved across the whole property and into the surrounding forest, and I could hear it settling into the dark after it ended, the way a sound that large takes a moment to leave a space fully. Then it stood there, chest working, blood visible on the right shoulder from where the rifle shot had hit, surrounded by 90 minutes of work. The barn is partially open, the coops flat, 3 steers dead in the pasture, my ATV overturned in the equipment shed, a diesel drum through the wall of the smaller barn, and Bigfoot standing in the middle of my driveway in the dark, not moving, not looking at any of it. Then Bigfoot turned back toward the pasture. I thought it was leaving. I was wrong. It walked back through the field slowly, not at the pace it had used during the kills, but something slower and more deliberate, the way you walk through a space when you're looking at it rather than moving through it. It stopped near the first steer it had killed and stood there for close to 30 seconds, not feeding, not doing anything I had a category for, just standing over the dead animal in the dark, the way you stand over something when you're making a decision about it. Then it moved to the fence line where the third steer had gone through. It stopped at the gap, looked at the broken posts, and grabbed one of the remaining upright posts with both hands. It didn't pull it down. It just held it for a moment, and then it let go and kept walking toward the eastern edge of the pasture. I was watching all of this from the house window with the rifle in my hands and no clear idea of what I was watching. The rampage had a shape to it when it was happening. Livestock, barn, shed, coops, truck. But this was different. Bigfoot moving slowly through the pasture in the dark, stopping at things, not destroying them, not eating anything. It looked like something taking stock. At the eastern tree line, it stopped again, and for the second time that night, it turned back and looked at the ranch. This time, the pause was longer than the first. Not 10 seconds, closer to 20 or 25. I stood at the window, and I did not move, and I did not lower the rifle, and I watched Bigfoot stand at the edge of my property and look back at everything it had done. There was a specific quality to those 20 seconds that I haven't been able to put clean language around in the years since. It wasn't the stillness of an animal that had stopped to rest or to listen. It was the stillness of something that was present in a different way than it had been during the previous 90 minutes, the whole night. It had been in motion, and in motion with a purpose, but standing at that tree line in the dark, looking back at the ranch, it was something else, something that registered what it was looking at. Then it stepped into the trees and was gone. Tom and his son stayed until sunrise. We didn't go into the tree line that night. There are decisions you make in those hours before dawn that you don't explain to people who haven't been in them. Practical decisions based on what you've just watched for 90 minutes. None of us said much. Tom's older son sat in the truck with the engine running and the headlights pointed at the tree line the whole time. Not because it would have helped, but because doing something felt better than doing nothing. Tom himself walked the driveway perimeter twice with a flashlight, checking the ground, not saying what he was looking for. His younger son stayed close to the house with me. We listened to the forest for sounds that never came, whatever had been in. Those trees all night had gone quiet, and the quiet was worse than the noise had been, because at least when there was noise, you knew where it was. At first light, I walked the property. The main barn's front wall was gone from the left corner to approximately 2/3 of the way across. The frame was exposed, and 2 roof sections had collapsed into the interior, taking a workbench and most of the tool storage on the near wall down with them. The smaller barn had a 2-foot breach from the diesel drum, with fuel still seeping into the floorboards when I got there. The smell of it carried across the whole yard. The 3 dead steers were where they had fallen. The first 2 were close together in the near section of the pasture. The third was at the fence line. The posts around it splintered and splayed outward from the impact. I stood next to that steer for a while. It was a 730-pound animal, and it had been carried 30 feet off the ground before it was thrown. I have been a rancher for over 20 years, and I could not have told you before that night that anything was capable of that. The footprints in the soft ground near the eastern fence were the clearest physical record of everything. I measured several of them before the morning dew softened the edges. 18 inches long, 5-toed, full heel impression. The stride spacing ran close to 60 inches. I photographed everyone I could find, and I documented the drag mark from the calf, which was still visible running from the center of the pasture to the tree line, a wide compressed channel in the grass that the overnight damp hadn't closed over yet. I stood at the tree line for a long time, not going in, just standing at the edge of it, looking at where the drag mark ended and the forest started, thinking about the 200 yards of dark between that point and where we had found the calf the night before. The blood by the chicken coop had pooled on the ground near where Bigfoot was standing when I fired. Dark red, almost brown, which I noted at the time. I collected it with what I had on hand and sent it to a small independent lab that a wildlife contact had recommended. The results took 6 weeks. The DNA analysis came back as a primate, not bear, not any known predator species, not human. The sample showed primate markers that didn't correspond to any catalog species in the databases the lab used. The technician who processed it called me directly after the results came in and asked where the sample had come from. I told him about a predator attack on my property. He asked what species. I told him I didn't know. He told me the sample was going into a separate file, and that if I had more material, I should send it. I never followed up on that call. I've thought about why, and the honest answer is that I wasn't sure what following up would produce that I was ready to deal with. The 25 seconds at the tree line after Bigfoot had walked back through the pasture, after it had stood over the dead steer, after it had held that fence post and let it go. That second look was longer than the first, and it happened after everything was already finished. There was no functional reason for it. The night was over, and my ranch had been torn apart. I was in the house, and Tom was in the driveway, and neither of us was a threat anymore. And Bigfoot stood at the edge of that tree line for 25 seconds and looked back anyway. I don't know what that means. I know it happened, and I know that something capable of carrying a 730-pound steer and throwing it through a fence is also capable of standing at a tree line for 25 seconds and looking back at a ranch in the dark for reasons I cannot explain using anything I know about animal behavior. In total, Bigfoot killed 51 chickens, 3 steers, and 1 calf. It caused $85,000 in structural damage and left a set of DNA results sitting in a file at an independent lab. Whatever walked out of my tree line that night, it came back. Not that night, not for several months, but it came back. And that's a different story. A few weeks before the attack on my farm, I read a news report that Big had attacked one Dale Mercerfoot. However, the Bigfoot that attacked me was not the same. That raises 3 strange questions. How many Bigfoots are in America? How many Bigfoots are on Earth? And most importantly, is Bigfoot the only mythical creature in existence?